What's up, everybody? Nate here. So in case you missed it, President Joe Biden was recently on 60 Minutes and he talked all things economy and inflation. Namely, that he believes that inflation has already been tamed in the United States and that the US is going to be able to lower it even more sometime soon. Not only that, he believes that the Federal Reserve is going to be able to achieve a soft landing with their monetary policy. That means we will effectively completely avoid a recession and our economy is going to be booming once again. So today I want to give you my thoughts on what Joe Biden just said about inflation and our economy. We're going to go over if he's right, if the US has actually gotten a handle on inflation and the economy, what is truly going on in our country right now, and what we can expect to see in the future. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is kind of point out a few quotes from Joe Biden directly. So he essentially says, let's put this into perspective. The inflation rate month over month was just an inch hardly at all. In the meantime, we've created all of these jobs and prices have gone up, but they've come down for energy. All right, so the numbers that Biden is referring to here is the Consumer Price Index numbers. This CPI report is published every single month in the US, and it basically looks at a basket of different goods and services. This will tell you if prices are going up and by how much, and if prices are going down, and of course by how much, and that gives you an average of what inflation is in the US. Consumer prices, or the CPI inflation report, was up by around 9.1% back in June 2022. Now, since then, it has slowly started to decrease, and it's because of the reasons that Joe Biden mentioned. Mainly, energy prices have started to go down. When we talk about energy prices, we're talking about gasoline mostly, but we're also talking about natural gas and a few other things like electricity. Most Americans spend a lot of their income on energy, so with those costs going down, namely gasoline, Americans are saving a lot of money. Just a few months ago, gas in the US was around $5 on average per gallon. It has since dropped down to just under $4 a gallon in the United States. So this is a pretty big drop in prices, and that means overall inflation is coming down. Now, inflation went from 9.1% to 8.5% and is now sitting at 8.3%. But during that same time, other costs that Americans spend a lot of their income on has gone up, like food costs have gone up and shelter costs are way up year over year. So Americans are still paying a lot more for other things, but they are saving some money on gas. But the problem is they're spending a lot of their money on food and shelter, so they're not really saving money overall. Those things are going up in cost, but they're just not spending it on gas anymore. They're spending it on food and shelter. Now, one thing Biden talked a lot about is that he has created around 10 million jobs since his administration took over, and that means that people have a whole lot more money, but it also means that inflation is going to go up because we do now need a whole lot more dollars than we did before. Businesses now have to pay people a lot more than they were before because we have inflation going up, and because those jobs didn't exist before, or there just weren't as many people employed, now there's more money circulating around. So that means people can of course buy more, but that means there's also a supply and demand problem. This is also a really skewed statistic in general because in the last administration, well, we had the pandemic and we had really high unemployment because businesses didn't have the money to hold on to people at the beginning of the pandemic. Jobs were eliminated and there was a lot of jobs lost, but now the pandemic has really taken a back seat to our economic problem, so there's been a lot of jobs growth. As things started to open up in 2021, businesses really started to hire more people as demand went back up. The same thing happened with gas prices. Gas prices started to go way back up because there was suddenly a lot of demand, but not a whole lot of supply. With people spending so much money though, like I said, that kind of threw off our entire equilibrium in every single market. Now people were buying almost too much and businesses were hiring way too many people because there was just so much capital available in the United States. That is causing some real problems today because businesses are having to lay off a bunch of workers as liquidity from investors and sales is suddenly starting to disappear. His argument for the inflation side is, well, inflation hasn't really gone up. They have inflation controlled now, but what you need to understand is the reason that inflation is mostly controlled is not entirely due to the federal government. There are a few small things that they have done to lower inflation in the United States. But for the most part, a lot of the issues that we're facing with inflation have to do with supply chain issues in other countries, namely the energy problems in general. So like I said, gasoline prices have gone down, but that's not because the United States is suddenly producing a whole lot more gas. We are starting to make more of it, but the reason gas is down in general is because the war between Russia and Ukraine well, that has not caused a huge energy crisis here in the United States. It's causing a big problem in Europe, but not here in the US. In addition, the OPEC Plus nations have started to make more gasoline, and they're starting to send it all throughout the world, which helps us a lot considering we have really high demand. And lastly, gasoline that we do produce and the oil that we do produce in the US has had some really good luck. We haven't had a ton of natural disasters and really bad weather like in the Gulf of Mexico over the last couple of months. That means that oil refineries don't have to go down. They're staying in commission, which means they can make a lot more gas. And finally, the one thing that President Joe Biden has done is pull out millions of barrels of oil from the United States strategic reserves, but that is not going to last forever. But effectively, the United States government has not really done a whole lot to address inflation in the United States. Biden has talked a lot about clearing up our ports in the US and trying to clear up supply lines so that way we can get trucks and we can also get cargo ships into the US a whole lot easier, but that is a multi-year plan. That's not something that's going to happen overnight, and it's not really something that's having a big effect today. Maybe in the future it might keep inflation down, but for now it's pretty much just costing money. And that is typically the federal government's response to everything. This is not a Joe Biden issue. This is not a previous administration issue. This is the federal government's response to everything. They recently passed the Inflation Reduction Act, and that reduces some healthcare costs. It also has a big investment into renewable energy resources in the United States. So that means in the future we may have some better sustainable energy and costs can come down in the future. But like I said, that's not really helping us today, and that bill costs around $500 billion. President Joe Biden has also contributed to our money problems in the US. So one of the reasons that we're facing inflation in 2022 is because in 2020 and in 2021, the Federal Reserve and federal government printed trillions upon trillions of dollars in stimulus, and the Fed printed way more during their quantitative easing program on Wall Street. This was money that was basically supposed to stimulate the economy, so people had a whole lot more to spend. We also had some federal programs like the mortgage moratorium program. You didn't have to pay your mortgage, and also federal student loans were paused and are still paused until January of 2023. That ensured that there was way more spending because it freed up Americans' paychecks and they could spend it however they wanted to. Consumer spending drives around 70% of our GDP, so without spending, we can't really grow our GDP, we can't grow our businesses, and the like. People aren't going to get paid, and that was the big concern of our entire economy during the pandemic and the very early parts of the pandemic. So that is why the Federal Reserve printed all this money and why the federal government printed trillions of dollars in stimulus. But then at the end of 2021, the federal government doubled down. They passed Joe Biden's infrastructure program, which costs around $1.2 trillion. And on top of that, they've also now passed the Inflation Reduction Act. Now we have around $2 trillion on top of the trillions of dollars that we already printed, now eventually going to be in circulation, and that is just going to cause inflation to go up. And to be completely clear here, inflation has come down in the United States. That is a fact, but it is still way too high. Inflation at 8.3% is way too high considering Americans don't make enough in order to keep up with that every single month. And even though inflation has come down, we do not have price stability as of yet. That brings us to the Federal Reserve side. Is the Federal Reserve going to be able to achieve a soft landing in 2022 or in 2023, meaning that we avoid a recession? Right now, what the Federal Reserve is doing in 2022 is aggressively and very quickly raising its benchmark interest rates. The reason they want to do that is to suck a lot of the demand out of our economy. As they raise their interest rates, well, that makes it a lot harder for Americans to borrow money. And if they can't borrow money, they're not going to be able to spend as much, effectively keeping prices down or even lowering them. And that's exactly what the Fed wants in the auto market, in the housing market, and in the credit market. They don't want as much money circulating around. They want to make it a lot harder for you to spend money in 2022. This also trickles into businesses though, because it's harder for people to get a mortgage, it's harder for people to get a small business loan or to take on debt to invest in companies. And that means that businesses on the New York Stock Exchange and just across the entire world are not getting as much money as they did before. So now they don't have as much money, and because inflation is so high and prices are out of control, people also can't afford their basic goods and services, so they're not buying as much, and businesses are not able to get that investor liquidity, so they're basically shrinking and they're not able to grow, and they're starting to fire people. But this is exactly what the Federal Reserve wants, because in their mind, if businesses have less money, if they start firing people, then naturally we're going to have a spike in unemployment. Unemployment is at a historic low right now, but for the Federal Reserve, it needs to be higher. If people don't have jobs, then they can't buy things, and if they can't buy things, then inflation comes down. So is it possible to achieve a soft landing here? Well, maybe, but it's pretty unlikely in 2022. The reason being is because the Federal Reserve only has so much control over our economy and inflation. The Federal Reserve decides how much money is actually printed in the United States, and they have another effect on demand with their monetary policies. If they raise their interest rates really high, it's hard for people to spend money. If they lower them, it's really easy for people to spend money. But that's really all that they can do. The federal government and the Federal Reserve does not control what businesses do with wages or with prices. So by them effectively raising their interest rates, yeah, it's going to have an effect on our economy and inflation, because people are not going to have any money because we're going to lose jobs. But directly, it's not going to bring down the cost of food. It's not going to bring down the cost of shelter. Basically, what I'm saying here is the Federal Reserve is not going to have a direct effect on inflation. So long story short, I'm not really sure if I agree with President Joe Biden here. I mean, inflation is still a serious problem in our economy. Yes, it has gone down, but Americans are spending more money than ever on food and shelter costs this year. Largely, is the control and the slight drop of inflation mainly due to the federal government? I don't really think so. I do think that inflation is eventually going to come down in the United States, but I do think that it's going to be an extremely bumpy road on the way there. One caveat that I have in this video is our entire economy boomed like it never had before over the last couple of years because all of this unprecedented money printing and extremely low interest rates. What you've got to keep in mind now is if we do see a recession and we do see some economic shrinking, it's probably just going to shrink down to what should be a normal level. We were way up here, and maybe we have to come down to about here in order to be normal. Our economy kind of goes in cycles, and right now we are near the bottom of a cycle right now, but eventually I firmly do believe that the US economy is overall strong and that it is going to go up in the future. That is it for me, everybody. Be kind out there, and I'll see you all in the next one.